So thanks so much for having me back. So I'm going to share a screen in a moment, but I was asked by Rabbi David, which is why we have the title we do, Megillat Esther, what does it say about femininity or even feminism? So I left it as it was, and what I really am interested in particular is transformation. I'm looking at through the Book of Esther how Esther is transformed, whether she's transformed, and what possibly that might have to do with femininity, or as I will say, feminisms. I wouldn't want to say there was one type of feminism. Okay, so I'm going to share a screen with you. As always, if something's unclear or there's a misunderstanding, I haven't made something clear, also put that in the chat box. I'm happy to respond to that. I did, when I prepared this sheet, I think I had an hour, so I'm going to speed through it reasonably quickly, but I hope that's okay. All right, again, as Beth said, please do ask questions through the chat. Okay, so let me share my screen. Share screen. Share. Okay, so you should have something that says Megillat Esther. Can someone just put a thumbs up if you've got it? Everyone can say, okay, great, that's great. Okay, so this was your blurb. This year will explore the role that Esther played in overturning the fate of Persian Jewry. Were her relationships with Mordechai, Achashverosh and Haman demonstrative of an historic femininity, or did they manifest a more contemporary feminism? Okay, so to begin, let's think about those words themselves. So femininity, I haven't brought you any sort of academic, too highfalutin definitions of femininity and feminism. We're just going to look at the basics, because that is not per se the topic of the day, but obviously we want to frame what I want to talk about. So femininity, this is just from Wikipedia, and it's very selected, little pieces that I thought were quite actually quite good and pretty relevant. And of course it turns out, by the way, that when I did this I had to edit one of the pieces in Wikipedia, as I didn't think it was good enough. Okay, femininity, also called womanliness or girlishness, is a set of attributes, behaviors and roles generally associated with women and girls. Although femininity is socially constructed, research indicates that some behaviors considered feminine are biologically influenced. So that sentence there, that although to influence, is probably the most highly charged of the sentences and most important. And what is most important about it for me in the context of Esther is this idea that femininity is socially constructed. How ought a woman behave in Persia 2,500 years ago? How ought she behave, right? What was expected of her? And to say that it's socially constructed makes for us a kind of an easy framework within which to work and to analyze her behavior. To what extent femininity is biologically or socially influenced is subject to debate. Okay, I would say huge debate. It is distinct from the definition of the biological female sex, as both males and females can exhibit feminine traits. And then it gives you this list. And I thought I would include this because not only is it slightly worrying and disturbing, but it's also quite fun and very interesting in terms of, again, our shiur this evening. Traits traditionally cited as feminine include gracefulness, gentleness, empathy, humility, sensitivity. Though traits associated with femininity vary across society and individuals and are influenced by a variety of social and cultural factors. You know, they're trying not to get yelled at here on Wikipedia, but anyway, it's useful, I think, and helpful in terms of structuring today's shiur. So I want to think about a little bit, move into, by process through this definition, into feminism or feminisms. So I wanted to have a look at this overview, and I think it's quite useful. Despite the terms femininity and masculinity being in common usage, there is little scientific agreement about what femininity and masculinity are. Among scholars, the concept of femininity has varying meanings. You can read this yourself. I'm happy to send these notes later to Beth. In 1949, French intellectual Simone de Beauvoir, so that was translated, of course, in 1953, I think, that in the second sex, she wrote the second sex, wrote that no biological, psychological, economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. And one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So this line, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, is the line that is quoted of de Beauvoir most. And that becoming has been very much a part of the feminist movement. So here we're moving from the idea of femininity to the concept of feminism. an idea that was picked up in 1959 by Canadian-American sociologist Irving Goffman, and in 1990, American philosopher Judith Butler. And Judith Butler is one of the women about whom my PhD depends, or on whom my PhD depends. So Judith Butler is someone with whom I'm very familiar, who theorized that gender is not fixed or inherent, but is rather a socially defined set of practices and traits that have over time grown to be labeled as feminine or masculine. So again, what is the framework within which we're thinking about how Esther behaves, or how she's even able to behave, how she can behave? What are the limits of what she can do and achieve? That perhaps would be a socially defined set of practices. Okay, leaving that aside, you can read the rest yourself later. Feminism. And again, I refuse to write the word feminism, so I called it feminisms. As we know, generally political ideas and thoughts, social movements are very varied and not homogeneous. Okay, so this is a useful, I think, nevertheless, definition, again, just from Wikipedia. Feminism is a range of social movements, political movements, and ideologies that aim to define and establish the political, economic, personal, and social equality of the sexes. It doesn't have anything about religion in here, by the way. That's something we might want to think about. Feminism incorporates the position that societies prioritize the male point of view and that women are treated unjustly within those societies. Efforts to change that include fighting against gender stereotypes and establishing educational, professional, interpersonal opportunities and outcomes for women that are equal to those for men. Okay, this is not a shir about orthodoxy and feminism. I'm very happy to give that at a later date, or a set of shirim, but so we're really constrained to time. But nevertheless, I hope that those are useful in thinking about what it was possible for Esther to do, what she did manage to do, and then retrospectively, how we imagine her behavior. In other words, when I say how we imagine her behavior, I mean, how do we think of it in terms of a feminist ideology? Could we imagine that she did it in order to say, look what women can do? Or would that be taking what she does far too far and trying to label it, as it were, or perceive it only through the lens of contemporary feminism? Okay. Persian life and Persian Jewry. I'm not going to go into that now, but I found two very interesting pictures, both of men, which I thought was useful for today's shiur. There we go. That's Persian Jewry. It's male. Okay. The matter of consent, let's begin. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to very much, which is what I usually do during shiurim, is take you through the psukim themselves. Okay, I want you to look at the verses, and the verses themselves, the text itself is pregnant with, is full of the ideas that we want to explore. I don't need to go to lots of different mafarshim, lots of different commentators, or possibly contemporary theorists about what it was that Esther did or thought, but rather you can read it in the words themselves. How does it start? What do we know about Esther? Chapter 2, verse 7. I will slip into my Ashkenazis very quickly. Okay, Esther was brought up. She was an orphan. She was brought up. We're not quite sure. Okay, she was a niece of Mordechai, because she had no father and mother, and she was beautiful of form and lovely to look at. Again, there's lots of women that is said about in Tanakh in general, in biblical narrative. But when, and this is relevant, her father and mother died, lakacha Mordechai lo levas. Mordechai took her for himself, as it were, as a daughter. Okay, again, lots of different understanding. Was it really a daughter? Did he end up marrying her? Leaving those different ideas or different points of view aside, this word lakacha makes her a very passive participant, right, in her own experience. She didn't have any choice here. Nobody asked her what she wanted to do. We're not exactly sure how old she was, but she was taken. Okay, and this idea of being taken, I think, smacks of lack of consent. She certainly wasn't asked. The text doesn't tell us she was asked. Why is this relevant? Perhaps the text wouldn't tell us she was asked, you might say. Let's have a look here then. This is much earlier. Okay, this is in Bereshis, in Genesis, and this is the story of Rivka. Okay, Eliezer is sent by Abraham. Eliezer is sent by Abraham to find a wife for his son Isaac. He's sent on a special journey with lots of rules and regulations about how to find a wife. And what happens? He was just explaining, Eliezer, he's at the well, what he's doing there. And out comes or emerges Rivka, and she's the daughter of Besuel ben Milcah, Eshes Nahor Ache Abraham, basically Abraham's niece. V'chada al shichmah, and she was carrying a jar on her shoulder. So she's a busy woman, okay? She's doing stuff. V'hana tovas mareh ma'od, she was also very beautiful. Basula, and a virgin. V'ish lo yada, and a virgin, twice. Again, not the topic for the day, but nevertheless very interesting. Okay, she went down, okay? She's busy. I could have highlighted these verbs actually. She went down to the well and she filled up her jug, okay? And then she came up. In fact, I'm annoyed that I didn't. I wonder if I can do it now. So have a look at that. She's a busy person. She's doing stuff. So in contradistinction to Esther that we just saw, who had things done to her, here we have Rivka, who is busy, active, verbing, she's doing stuff, okay? And then Eliezer runs towards her, calls her, and he says to her, may I have some water from your jar? V'tomer, and she says, Shtei adani, of course, drink. V'temaher, v'tered, and she rushed off and she went down, kadat alayda, and she picks up basically her jar, v'tashkehu, and she gives him to drink. Look at that. Very short sentence, how many things she does. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, again, in contradistinction to Esther, she's a busy woman doing stuff. Keep going. When she'd finished watering him, as it were, she said, I'll give also to your camels. Eshav, I will go and draw water. Adim kilo lishtos, until they finish. Okay, drinking. And then look at this pasuk again. I just split it. The point here, but to my hair, but and she does it again. Okay, she runs, she goes down, she runs again, and she fills up the water jug. Okay, and she gives all his camels. Okay, now here's a space 20. This is verse 20, and we're jumping to verse 50. Okay, everybody see that space? A lot goes on in the middle. Okay, she brings Eliezer home. She says, I found this bloke at the well. Apparently, he's Uncle Abraham's servant, and they go through the whole story. And Eliezer said, I come. I need to find a wife for Isaac. I think this is her. What do you think? They say, definitely. And what does Lavan say? V'ya'an la'avan u'vutsuel. And Lavan and Besuel say, v'yomer, and they say, me Hashem yatsa hadavar. This thing, in other words, this serendipity, right, that you met at the well, that comes from God. They play the passive participant themselves. It's nothing to do with me. Obviously, God has interfered here. Hine, lo nuchal daber alecha. We can't say a thing about it, ra or tov, good or bad. Actually, bad or good in that order. But who are we to say anything? Clearly, God has sent you. Clearly, you've met Rivka, and it's all been orchestrated by God. Hine, Rivka lefanecha. Look, Rivka's right here. Kach v'lech. Take her, in brackets, and go. She's yours. Usehi isha leven adonecha, and she will be a wife to the son of your master, i.e. to Isaac. Ka'asher dibar Hashem, just as God has said. Now, of course, God hasn't said anything. In these 30 intervening psukim, we see that Eliezer feels that God is involved, but actually it's Abraham who has orchestrated the journey, Eliezer who has made the journey, and Rivka herself who has been the active participant in getting Eliezer water, his camel's water, and bringing him home to her father. Now, you see here that there is the patriarchal hierarchical system. Both Lavan and Besuel say, her relatives basically, father and brother say, take her, she's yours, bevakasha. And then we have this very, very interesting pasuk. Okay, again, you can see I've gone from 51 to 55 because there's a bit in between that suggests she shouldn't go now, she should go a bit later, and we'll see that continues now. I'll read the English, but her brother and her mother said, let the maiden remain with us some 10 days, and then you can go. In other words, let us get her trunk ready, get her dowry ready. Let's sort her out. If she's on her way, you know, and she's going off to get married, can we have a bit of time? And he says to them, back to them, Al ta'achranu, Osi, please don't make me wait. For Hashem hitzliach darachai, so God has made my journey so successful. Shalchuni ve'elcha la'odini, and I want to go back to Avraham. And then we have, I think, the most important pasuk in this story with regard to our topic, Vayomru. So again, her brother and her mother say, we're not sure whom, Nikra l'na'ara, let's call her V'nish'ala, and we'll ask her, SP her, what her mouth, that means we'll ask her mouth, what does she say? Okay, so this is again a very, very important pasuk, and actually quite a very important pasuk in terms of the issue of consent. I don't know if those of you who are Radio 4 listeners, but there's quite a lot about consent in the media at the moment in terms of Jewish marriages. If you listened to it a couple of weeks ago, you'll know that this issue is very questionable. What does consent exactly mean? What are forced marriages and what are arranged marriages? Okay, so this is a highly contemporary issue. But here we see that they ask Rivka. Now, one might have thought that Lavan had the final word. If the father says she's going, right? I memean, that might have been our assumption, our hava amina, our basic assumption about how society worked then, and certainly how Lavan worked. He's not considered a particularly lovely fellow. Okay, what do? They ask her. Bakarula Rivka, they call her, and they say to her, do you want to go with this man? Vatomer elech. And she says, I will go. So when I was talking about Esther being taken and not being asked, you could say, well, that's how it was in biblical narrative, right from the story of Bereshit until the end of Tanakh. Our exit, what are you expecting, Lindsay? What do you think this was? Post Simone de Beauvoir, right? What are your expectations here? Of course, she wouldn't be asked, right? Of course, she would do as she's told. And who would be there to support her? Well, what are your expectations? But I would argue back and say, no, we have a precedent here in the Torah many years before Esther, where the girl herself, and she's a young girl, is asked whether she wants to go. And she says, I do want to go. But what is also interesting about Rivka is that she's introduced to us with these prior psukim, all of them filled with vataf, so that's the feminine doing of something, and she's just doing and doing and doing. She's an incredibly active participant in her own life, and therefore when she says elech, I will go, to some extent it shouldn't be surprising. Okay, now let's go back to the Megillah. And our story continues with Esther, and we have Achashverosh looking for a new wife. And again, we're not really, I think we have to take an imaginative leap as to how the experience of being in Achashverosh's kingdom felt, and when he demanded that all the virgins be rounded up, that you have, like, unfortunately, we know what it means to be round up. You have to go, okay? So when Mordechai hears about the young women rounded up and taken to the palace of the king, that's what he did. But have a look here. So when they hear about this decree, when they had to collect, right, what does it say, gather, okay, like the word kibbutz, okay, they take all these young women to the capital Shushan to be looked after by Haggai. V'tilakach Esther, in the passive form, Esther was taken. Doesn't say Esther went, it's very similar. V'tilakach, Esther was taken. Again, a repetition. So now we're in chapter 2, later, and here we have a repetition of Esther's passivity. She's taken to the palace, Eliad Haggai, Shomer Hanashim, okay, in the custody of Haggai, the keeper of the women. Now, here you can see there's 3 dots because I'm skipping a few verses again, and we have verse 15. Okay, and we have a repetition of this. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Avichal, the uncle of Mordechai, who had taken her for his daughter, so we knew this already. right? We're already told that he had taken her for a daughter many psukim before, but we're told again. And I think, again, that's to emphasize the position of Esther. Kal v'chomer, how much more so in the king's palace, right? Bad enough she's taken by her uncle, how much more so that she's taken by the king. Lavo el melech, and when it's her turn to go to the king, lo viksha davar, she doesn't ask for anything. And what does that mean? It means they ask for perfume and clothing and jewelry, but she says, no, I'll go as I am, thank you very much. One could argue, but one could also argue that she just has no voice. Okay, at this point in her life, she's not able to ask for anything. Okay, she doesn't have the capacity. Okay, she's been taken by Mordechai, and now she's been taken by Haggai, and in a minute she's going to be taken by the king, all without her consent. You can argue that, Lindsay, how can you compare Haggai and Achashverosh and Mordechai, right? Didn't Mordechai take her for the good? Maybe. But nevertheless, she's a passive participant in those experiences. And I can be sure of that because the same verse, the same word, is used in all of those verses, lakach, taken. And never is her voice mentioned or even asked. Okay, now here though there is a change, and this is what not the word lakach, of course. Here there is a change. They know that all the women would know that they were going to go into the king, and that they could ask. She's not asked directly here, but that they could ask for something they desired, as I said, jewelry and so on. But she doesn't ask for anything. Okay, now the last pasuk in this section is the next one, V'tilakach Esther, same word again, it's getting a bit repetitious, Lindsay. And Esther was taken, El HaMelech Achashverosh, to the king Achashverosh, El Beit Machoso, to his palace, B'chodesh HaAsiri, in the 10th month, Chodesh Teves, which is Teves, B'shnat Shavat L'Machoso, in the 7th year of his reign. So here we have the last of the tilakachs. So we're going to end here in terms of passive participation, but you can see me laboring the point, okay? Esther is taken, then she's taken, then she's taken again, okay? And she doesn't say anything, and we don't hear about her own wishes or desires. Okay, now we have our story, right? The story of Purim. What happens? There's a decree made by Haman that all the Jews should be killed. Okay, we're not going to get into the ins and outs of stories. I'm presuming some familiarity, but also that unfortunately that's not my topic for the day. But what happens is Esther happens to be, whether by chance or consequence or as directed by God, in the right place at the right time. But Mordechai says to her, and again, this smacks of her lack of choice in the matter. Mordechai says to her, when she says to him, what can I do? What can I do to save the Jews? I'm just a mere young woman with very little power in the king's palace. What are you asking from me? And Mordechai responds, and he says, Vayomer Mordechai lahashiv el Esther, tell Esther, al tadami b'nafshech, don't think you will be saved. Nafshech, nefesh, right? That your soul, that your life will be saved. Limale beit hamelech mikol hayudim. Okay, just because you're in the king's palace safe and sound, and that the Jews, what happens to the Jews won't happen to you. Ki im chacharesh tacharishi, because if you do not speak, if you keep quiet, that's called lashon kaful, double language, okay? It's a literary tool for telling us something about the transformation that is about to occur with Esther. It's an emphasis. It's a narrative tool of emphasis. Hecharish tacharishi. Do not keep quiet. Really don't keep quiet. Be'ez hazos at this time. If God wants the Jews saved, the Jews will be saved from somebody else, right? If you're not up for the task, fine, someone else will do it. And you and your family will all be destroyed. And who knows? Whether it was for this time that you were made, as it were, or came to royalty. Okay, you became royalty. Now, I heard a very interesting shiur today, actually. His name's gone right out of my head. Give me a second. Spanish and Portuguese. Rabbi Mason, jump in at any time.
Rabbi Dweck, Lindsay.
Rabbi Dweck, thank you. Yes, Rabbi Dweck gave a shiur earlier. Thank you. And he spoke, you know, he goes, this was not a rabbinic thing to say. If you want to say that Mordechai was a nice, frum Jew and was trying to educate his daughter stroke wife, he may have said to her, God has chosen you, Gewalt, you're in the right place at the right time, go for it. He doesn't say that. He says, you know, who knows? Maybe it is you, maybe it isn't you. I don't know. But the beautiful part about that is that she then has a choice. Okay, in other words, if he doesn't say to her, Gewalt, if you were really frum, you'd know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Heilige Eibishter, right? God Almighty himself has chosen you. You've got to get on and do it. Then you might say, well, again, Esther did choice. You might anyway say that. Look at her, she's stuck in the king's palace. Anyway, what's she going to do? But nevertheless, what these two psukim do is they give her the reality. It doesn't have to be you. You could die with the Jews, or you could choose to do something about it. And I think that space there of being given a choice is a new experience for Esther. And for me, this is the transformational moment, okay, in chapter 4. So 1, 2, 3, we're quite deep into the story. There's only ostensibly 9 prakim, 9 chapters. I know there's 10, but there's only 3 or 4 psukim in the last chapter. 3, I think. So there's really 9 meaty chapters of the story. And then we have this transformational moment, but we're quite deep into the story already. So let's see what Esther does and how she responds. First of all, we have V'tomer Esther. She's speaking. Now, she has spoken a bit before this time because she speaks to Mordechai and sends messages. But this idea of speaking is a different idea. Why? Lahashiv al Mordechai, she sends another message to Mordechai. And she doesn't just speak, she tells. She orders, okay? She might say requests if we're polite, but she definitely gives him what to do. Lech, go out, knos es kol haYehudim, gather all the Jews, hanimtzeim b'Shushan, that you can find in Shushan. V'tzumu alai, and fast for me. Okay, she starts to give him, as it were, jobs to do or specific requirements, not only for the entire Jewish people, but also just for herself. She sees herself as a person who is in some sense authoritative and can make demands. Okay, she makes demands. V'al tachlu v'al tishtu, and don't eat and don't drink shalosh yamim laila v'yom, for 3 days, night and day. Gam ani v'narasai atzum kain, and myself and my handmaids will fast accordingly. But atzum means I will fast. Okay, again, I am now an active participant in this story. Atzum uvachein, and thus avo. Okay, again, I will go El HaMelech, to the king. Asher lo kadas, that is not according to the law. I'm sure you're all familiar with the understanding of the Megillah, that there are always 2 levels of reading it. The God isn't mentioned, but every time the word Melech, king, is mentioned, we can either read it the pshat level, the simple reading of the text, which means the Melech refers to Melech Achashverosh, the king Achashverosh, or HaMelech, the king, i.e. God. Why is that relevant here? Asher lo kadas, I'm going to go to the king, visit the king of my own accord, that is not according to the law. And one could argue that that means unless King Achashverosh calls you, you don't knock on his door and say, King, I just fancied popping in, is that okay with you? You can't do that. But also there becomes a huge halachic problem that is not our topic for the day, but I cannot ignore. And the huge problem is brought by Rashi. And we'll look at that in a minute. But kasher avadati avadati, and if I die, I die. And that again is on 2 levels. Either I die because the king, Achashverosh, says, what do you think you're doing here? Did anyone call you? Off with her head. So not only is she taking action, is she an active participant, but she's risking her life. So we go from one extreme to the other. On the one hand, she's a passive participant, does nothing, and things are done to her. One might argue on Mordechai's behalf for her. But here we have her doing stuff, taking control, ordering Mordechai, but at the same time, she's risking her life to do so. So not only is she doing things, she's doing extreme things. Okay, Rashi says here, Asher lo kadas. Asher lo kadas, that is not according to the law. She'ein das lekanes asher lo yikareh. Okay, that it's not the law that she can enter, that means enter the king's chamber, asher lo yikareh, if she hasn't been called. Then he says exactly the same thing again, Asher lo kadas, because on the one level, Melech means King Achashverosh, but on the other level, it means God. And what does this mean? Asher lo kadas. Sha'ad ata, because until now, ba'ones, she was forced. And here the question is, what does it mean she was forced? Well, if Achashverosh called her, okay, she was forced to sleep with him, okay? She didn't have a choice. Va'achshav, but now she goes baratzon, of her own accord. And this has huge implications halachically. It's one thing to be taken, raped, right, by the king. It's another thing to go of your own accord, okay? And there are huge consequences to this for Esther. Again, not the topic of the day, but very important to realize the extent to which she's acting. In other words, she's not only going against the king by knocking on his door, as it were, but she's also going against, contrary to halacha, to Jewish law, by saying, I am willingly sleeping with the king, okay, which is very problematic. Okay, that is a side issue in terms of its consequences, but it is a huge issue in terms of a woman who decides to do something for herself. Okay, and of course, when it comes to sex, I hope there's no children online, even more so, consent becomes a huge issue. And she's consenting, whereas before she did not. Okay. And we continue, chapter 5. On the third day, she gets dressed. Okay, Malchus v'ta'amod, she gets dressed in royal clothes. V'ta'amod, and she stands b'chatzer beis hamelech, in the king's courtyard. Okay, we're not going to carry on the pasuk due to time. Vayehi kir'os hamelech, and when the king sees her, he puts out his scepter and says, come, don't worry, I'm letting you in. Vatikra Esther, and she comes forward, vatiga barosh sharbet, and she touches the end of the scepter. That's the kind of, you're welcome, and then there's like a peaceful gesture. But she is the one doing stuff, just like we saw with Rivka earlier, the tough, right, the she action verb, we see it vatilbash, vata'amod, vatikrav, vatiga. So you get the point. Then she calls a meal for herself, Achashverosh and Haman, and she does this twice. And these, I believe, bring us to the point of transformation, and one might argue the most feminist line in the Megillah. So first of all, we have a Tomer Esther, Imal Melech Tov. So she starts to talk to the king. She's speaking to the king, and she says, please come to another meal with Haman. Vayomer HaMelech, and what does the king say in response? Maharu es Haman, quickly call Haman, lasos es devar Esther, to do the bidding of Esther. So it's not only, and again, these are we could skip these quickly and not notice, but what is happening here now is that she has impact. Okay, so again, we see a transformation. The king is listening and responding. He says, I better do what the queen has asked, or I'd even like to do what the queen has asked, and I'm going to tell Haman to do the same. Remember, Haman is prime minister at the time, and Esther is merely one of the many women that Achashverosh has basically in his harem. Okay, and he asks her again, what do you want? And she says, I'd like you to come to another meal. Okay, we're not going to discuss this concept of 2 meals, but just notice that. This is the second meal. We're now in chapter 7. We missed chapter 6, by the way. Do you see this is chapter 5? And we skip to chapter 7. Chapter 6 is the chapter of hafuch, that we might say, of turning upside down the story of Purim, where the king's sleep, v'nadadash nas hamelech, the king's sleep is balayla hahu nadadash nas hamelech. That night, the king's sleep is disturbed. And this whole idea, again, of reading it on 2 levels, Achashverosh's sleep is disturbed. He's bothered about something. And the king, as in God's night, is disturbed because he too is bothered about the Jewish people. We skip now to chapter 7. Vayavo hamelech v'haman lishtos im Esther hamalka. And everybody should now be jumping up and down on their seat. What happens now? Haman and the king go to drink and eat with who? Who do they eat with? Someone jump in. It's not a rhetorical question. Can they unmute themselves, Beth? Oh no, they can't.
Hamalka.
Hamalka. I don't know who said that, but absolutely. Okay, that is Ikari. And again, you have got to be close readers of the text. Look at that. Who do they come to eat with and feast with? Esther the queen. Not Esther, not Achashverosh's wife, Esther the queen. So she's gone from an orphan, to a girl who's taken by someone else, to a girl who's taken by Haggai, to a girl who's taken by the king, to a young woman, one might argue, who then says, okay, I have to step up, who steps up and tells Mordechai what to do on her behalf and on behalf of the Jewish people, then asks the king. She doesn't tell the king, she asks the king. He responds and says, yes, let's do what Esther says. And then he says, we're going, come on, Haman, to this feast. Whose feast? Esther the queen. Okay, that should tell you everything you need to know, right? That Esther has been transformed through active participation. So one might argue that it is active participation itself that shifts her from a feminine ideal of a Persian woman at the time she exists to a woman who says, I can control the situation, I have some power and some authority even within the restrictions in which I find myself, and therefore I will do as much as I can within those restrictions. And again, the king says, what can I do? Okay. And she says, I need you to save my life. And she explains that there's a decree gone out to kill me and my people, and I would like you to do something about it. Were we taken into slavery, I wouldn't have asked you, but given that it's death, please do something. And the king responds, who is this terrible man who sent out this decree? And again, these are the transformational moments. V'tomer, Esther, she speaks again. And what does she say? She doesn't just say tentatively, delicately, right? Sensitively, all those words we saw in the definition earlier. She says, Ish, Tsar, V'oyev, Haman, Hara, Hazeh. And she points her hand. She goes, this disgusting, wicked, evil man right here. So you can see that that in and of itself should, spark in everybody this sense of somebody who speaks her mind and perhaps speaks truth to power. And then we see again, Vahaman niv'as milifnei, and Haman becomes afraid, terrified, milifnei, in front of who or whom? Hamelech, the king. He's scared for his life. V'hamalka. Okay, not only now is the king responding to the queen as the queen and wanting to do her bidding, but Haman is fearing for his life. Okay, the fact that he is, I know we've gone zooming through, but it's at this point we see that she's to some extent reached the ultimate goal of having power over somebody's life. I'm not saying this is an ideal that everybody would aspire to, but my point is that is where she reaches through her active participation. Keep going. And the next pasuk says, and the king in his fury left the wine. That's because he sees Haman, he thinks ostensibly try to seduce the queen. Vahaman amad levakesh al nafsho. And Haman gets up to plead for his own life. Me Esther hamalka. Now the king isn't even relevant. It's the queen. Okay, so I just want you to see the transformation in the text itself. I haven't at all brought you any commentaries, except for that one Rashi, that somehow expand and expound on the narrative text itself, which speaks to us so directly. Okay, lakha, lakha, lakha. She was taken, she was taken, she was taken, and then she begins to speak. Okay, then she speaks to power. And then she puts herself in a precarious situation in order to save the people. And then she claims Haman's destructive evilness in front of the king, points him out to the king. And then she is, as it were, the authority towards his death. Now, I'm going to stop sharing. Give me one moment. Has it stopped sharing? Okay, give me a thought. Good. So, and I want to conclude. And I want to conclude in the following way. And I know it's been a tour through the Megillah, but given the topic, I'd like to say the following things, I think. If you're asking whether Esther is a feminist icon, I'd say probably not. If you're asking whether Esther promoted feminist values and aspirations, I say she dealt with her personal and communal situation by transforming herself from a passive participant to an active participant. Nevertheless, I think she did this to save her people, not to make a feminist statement. However, could she retrospectively be imagined as a woman who held feminist values? Well, she spoke up when women generally were expected to be silent. She made demands from men in power, so that's both Mordechai and Achashverosh. She demonstrated that a man ought not to be allowed to fulfill his authoritarian decree, so that's Haman. And in that way, I feel she speaks truth to power. So then, yes, maybe she could be held up as a woman who espoused feminist values. But ultimately, I would like to say that either because of her femininity or despite it, or regardless of her feminist proclivities, she was a woman who did everything she could in the situation she found herself to ensure that as many lives as possible could be saved. And of course, she succeeded. And in her success, she sets a precedent, right? If we're talking about this week and about Purim, we call the Megillah Megillat Esther. In the end, it's named after Esther. In the end, she's the one that retains the name. And how many women get forgotten? How many women are invisible? How many women are anonymous? But not Esther. Esther becomes the heroine of the story, and there are halachic consequences to her actions. Okay, now in this handout, which I will send to Beth, you will see that the next few pages include all the halachic requirements of Purim and why women are obligated in them. But it turns out, since establishment of the festival of Purim, and since the writing of the Megillah by Esther and Mordechai, Jewish women are obligated in the 4 Purim mitzvot. So to read the Megillah, to hold a celebratory meal, to give mishloach manot, gifts of food to a friend, and to give charity to the poor. So ostensibly, Esther turns out to be the one who ensures that women are active participants in their own religious experience. And therefore, I would say in retrospect, we can say that she held feminist ideals, even if she wasn't or wouldn't presume herself to be a feminist. Okay, any questions? I'm done.
Yeah, we have a few questions. Thank you, Linz. Okay, the first question is from Tony. The cliche of Vashti and Esther is that Vashti's insubordination leads to powerlessness and Esther's passivity leads to power. To what extent do you agree? Oh, that's actually from Robert Marcus.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And Vashti in and of herself is a very interesting character. I mean, you know, in kindergarten and primary school, you know, it's done in that kind of Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter way, you know, baddies and goodies. But if you read about Vashti in some of the earlier sources, pre-medieval midrashim, the ones that are not so affected by the Christian, you know, pogroms and so on Jews, the way in which Vashti is spoken about is a much gentler way, actually, and she doesn't come across as kind of evil and wicked and the person who refuses Achashverosh because she doesn't like him. Rather, she's explored in the sense that she refuses him because he's clueless and he's going to make a mistake. And why I say this in response to the question is because the word that is used is v'tama'en, right? She refuses. And that word is only used one other place in Tanakh, which is Yosef, right? And there's a shalshelet there. There's 4 shalshelets again in the whole Tanakh. And no, Torah, 4 in the Torah, sorry, I think another 3 actually in the whole Tanakh, and 1, whatever, it doesn't matter where the others are, but the one is by Yosef because he refuses Eshet Potiphar, his boss's wife's seduction of him, and he's considered very positively through that. Right? In other words, she's compared with him because he's a positive character in refusing to be seduced, and so too she is a positive character in refusing to go to the king. Now the consequences for her are also death, and to some extent she mirrors Esther in that way, because the consequence of refusal is in her case death. Now, we don't know if it's death, by the way. We don't know. We never hear that she dies. That's an assumption. There's a question whether she dies or just gets chucked out the kingdom and so on and so forth. But it turns out that she really is the one with the power, because she was the one with the power, because she is Dariash's, what's his name? Daryavesh, I don't know, the rabbi's nodding, okay, daughter. So she was the one that had royal blood, as it were, and Achashverosh marries in. But yes, you're right. Her decision, but like Esther's decision, right, to go against the law, for her it means, yes, she's sent away or killed, whereas Esther's works out okay. I can't answer whether or not, you know, each of them should have done what they did, but to the extent that they stood up for themselves and for their people, in Esther's case, I can only presume, or actually reflect, that that was the appropriate thing that each of them felt they had to do. And you're right, in one case it worked out well, in the other one not so well. Yes, these are risky enterprises. They are.
Lindsay, how old was Esther when she was taken to Achashverosh?
Well, it depends who you ask. You know, it's asked 4 rabbis, get 26 answers. Yeah, the answer is I don't know. I mean, there are various answers. Most answers are that she was above 12, so she was a major in some respects, so one would have expected her to have some say. But there are others that, well, when she was orphaned, she was only 3 or only 9 when she came to Mordechai. So we're not sure. She was very young. I mean, she wasn't 22. You know, she was teenager, according to most people.